Welcome to the Personal Injury Marketing Minute, where we quickly cover the hot topics in the legal marketing world. I'm your host, Lindsay Busfield. Attorneys around the nation are picking up more and more rideshare accident cases. After all, the major companies like Lyft and Uber carry a $1 million insurance policy. However, these cases aren't without their challenges. As with all injury cases, the insurance company doesn't just want to hand over $1 million for every claim submitted. And sometimes $1 million just isn't enough to cover the extensive damage caused by many of these wrecks. The good news is that you can develop legal strategies to recover more than the million for your client's recovery or their family's loss. I recently attended the Atlas Lawyers Practice Management and Legal Marketing Seminar, where I heard attorney Katie Nealon of Munley Law present on how to break through this barrier. Thank you so much for joining us today, Katie.
Thanks for having me, Lindsay.
Well, tell us a little bit about yourself and about your practice.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you again for having me on the podcast. I'm very excited to be here and to kind of share my experiences with your listeners. So as Lindsay said, my name is Katie Nealon. I am an attorney who is licensed to practice in both California and Pennsylvania. I started my practice, however, in Pennsylvania, and I have been working at the Munley Law Firm for the past 13 years. And a lot of what we do here is, plaintiff personal injury work, and we focus on commercial auto crashes. So that might be rideshare, it might be tractor trailer, or just commercial vehicles in general, tow trucks, dump trucks, things of that nature. So that's a big part of my practice. And I've been doing that for the past 12 years, working on these commercial auto cases. I'm a board certified truck accident lawyer. So a lot of time spent with these commercial policies and trying to, get the maximum recovery for people who are going through a very, very difficult time in their life and have suffered sometimes the unimaginable.
Well, and that's a unique credential, that specialization. And I think I heard you and Chris at the beginning of your presentation talking, about how many people actually have that specialization. And I don't think that it's all that many in the United States.
Yeah, I think the last time I looked, it was around maybe 80 in the entire country have that distinction. And actually 3 of those 80 lawyers work at my firm. So
that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah. And clearly being able to work some of those commercial cases means that you are working with insurance policies that might have higher limits because they are commercial as opposed to individual policies. But what drew you into rideshare cases specifically?
Yeah, so certainly these commercial cases do, hopefully have better insurance coverages. But specifically with rideshare, when I was graduating from law school, that was really when rideshare started becoming popular. Prior to, I think, 2010, there wasn't anything like rideshare. There was taxis, of course, but rideshare really hit the market. And then several years after that, in 2012, 2013, 2014, they became very popular. And, you look around and there are hundreds, if not hundreds of thousands, depending on the city you're in, rideshare vehicles on the road every day. So, it's something that kind of piqued my interest early on in my career because it was this new developing area of law that really there wasn't a lot of regulations at the beginning. It was, and still there's work to be done, but it was this emerging area that had the potential to have devastating consequences on not just riders, but other motorists on the road, pedestrians. So that's kind of where it started for me, was, just the interest in these emerging market. And then, of course, just being a plaintiff's personal injury firm, every now and then we would have a rideshare case that would come into the office, an individual who was struck by a rideshare vehicle or was a passenger in one. So I started looking into the different documents that they have, the different insurance limits and things of that nature. And as my practice in this area continued to grow and I continued to get more experience with how they actually work, the day-to-day operations of these rideshare companies, other cases were coming in, larger injury cases were coming in. And that really kind of snowballed from there. It was something that I was very interested in and at the beginning, and then just diving into it and seeing, what's really going on inside these companies. It was a personal interest that I had. So, and luckily, we've been able to kind of fine tune that here at Munley Law and really get our hands dirty and into the mix with it and get some great results for our clients. So.
Well, and I love that. And there are so many attorneys that I talk to who are questioning whether or not they should niche down. And, what is the advantage of niching down? And, are you going to be losing clients that are not, within your specific niche if you do that? But I think if there is a large enough segment of the population and there are enough cases out there where it really justifies your intense focus on that particular area, then it can be huge to be a subject matter expert in a particular avenue and being able to really dive into where to look and how things function and be able to understand what pieces of information you need to pull from where and what documents you should be seeing and what gaps are you not getting when you are requesting documents for discovery. So being able to really focus in on that makes it so that you can serve your clients so much better and you can figure out legal strategies to break beyond what they are willing to initially hand you in these cases. So, but let's start with a little bit of the basics here. Can you walk us through the standard insurance coverage limits for rideshare accident claims? How does a case, I mean, there's no typical case, but how does a case typically work?
So you're right, there is no typical case, but insurance limits are regulated through the states a lot of the time, right? So every state has their mandatory minimums for auto insurance, and you'll see the same when it comes to rideshare companies. So typically the rideshare companies, it's called the transportation network company. It's a term of art that I think they chose for themselves, but they shorten it to TNC. So first place to look is always look at your state's TNC law. For example, like in Pennsylvania, the minimum that they have to have is 500,000 if they are, using the app and they're actively engaged in either getting a ride or having a passenger inside the vehicle. Now, that limit can vary depending on your jurisdiction. For example, I think New Jersey is 1.5 million, right? It's a significant difference. But typically, if you have one of the larger rideshare companies involved in the collision, they usually have about $1 million. So it's a limit that they impose on themselves, sometimes because the state requires them. But if the app is on and they're on their way to pick up a fare or they have a passenger in the car, typically you'll probably have $1 million in coverage on the vehicle and the driver for that specific instance. Now, of course, these companies, they're also going to have their own policies that might give you more above and beyond that 1 million, but you're pretty much going to be guaranteed $1 million if they have an active fare that they're picking up or in the car.
Right. And with a lot of these accidents, do you see that, whatever that coverage amount is that typically enough to cover the damages associated?
So that's a case-by-case analysis. In some cases, it could be enough, depending on the injuries that your client sustained. But in other cases, we've seen devastating impacts from some auto collisions where individuals are suffering from lifelong injuries or, unfortunately, sometimes they lose their lives in these accidents and they're leaving behind, a wife or a husband and their children. And in those cases, $1 million is not going to be enough to compensate them for the loss. And, in the case where you have somebody who has lifelong injuries, they're going to have life care plans. They're going to have medications and surgeries and medical treatments for the rest of their life. Sometimes they need to make modifications to their homes in order to just live a normal life. And we all know that comes at a cost. And unfortunately, healthcare is not going to cover all of that, or at least it's not going to give you the quality of life that you could have, right? And then in the case of a loved one's passing, that's it's kind of, you can't compensate for that, right? You can't bring them back, but you can at least try and find some coverage and some compensation for them so that their children can, they don't have to suffer that financial loss of losing the parent.
Right. And I mean, our court system does the best that it can to hold negligent parties accountable for the actions that they take. And yes, no amount of money is ever going to be able to bring back a loved one, but this is the best system that we have in place in order to compensate for that loss. And while we were at Atlas, you gave an example of a particularly moving story where you were helping a client who was struck by a rideshare driver and sustained long-term injuries. And this driver had a history of poor driving experiences, and you were able to bring in people that the driver had given rides to before, and you were able to hold the rideshare company accountable. Can you walk us through that example in a little bit more depth?
Yeah. So, in a lot of these cases, there's going to be confidentiality agreements. So I'll do my best to tell you what I can, of course. But yeah, so, a lot of these cases, they start off the same, right? You get the call in your office and you hear a tragic story, right? We had a young client who sustained a very significant brain injury. And, he required a lot of care and attention. And the strategy for a lot of these cases, it's always going to be, can you establish agency, right? Agency is one of the most, important things if you can establish it in your case, because then you get vicarious liability. And then you can get to those higher levels of insurance. So, when we were putting together our strategy, we here, we work in a team. And we had a lot of people working on this team day in and day out, trying to establish agency. So, we have that in mind. We look at our case law and what are the elements that we need to establish. But, when we first started working on these rideshare cases, it was a very new emerging area in plaintiff's personal injury work. And there really wasn't a lot of specific guidance, right? So we were kind of creating the playbook. But what we were doing too is we were looking at other jurisdictions, other states, what other judges were finding, what those rulings were in terms of establishing an employer-employee relationship or an agency relationship between the driver and the company. And we would use those good and bad opinions to try and formulate what we were going to do in our discovery and how we were going to be portraying our facts and how we were going to tell that story, right? So we really kind of started creating it from the ground up, and we looked everywhere, not just in personal injury cases. We were looking at employment law cases and workers' comp cases, right? So we scoured the country, and every opinion that came out, I put Google alerts on so that anytime there was a new case filed against any rideshare company, I knew about it. I pulled the documents. I looked and saw what's going on in that court. Is the court finding agency? Are they punting and saying that it's an issue for the jury? Or are they finding that there is no agency? And we wanted to model our case, obviously, in the most favorable way, into similar to cases where they're finding agency. So really, it was doing that deep dive in the beginning and knowing what the state of the law was, and then building our individual facts based on that. So going to the websites are going to give you tons of information about how these companies operate and how they treat their drivers and, what they expect out of their drivers and what limitations they put on them and what policies they have in place for them. So just simple things like going to their website is going to give you a wealth of information. And then you got to tailor your discovery based on what you find there and make sure that you're getting all of the, the information that company has on that specific driver. And, it's a lengthy process that we did in the beginning. but we were able to kind of fine tune it now. So it's, as the cases develop and as we work on more of these rideshare cases, we kind of have our roadmap. But it was a lot of work in the beginning. You got to put the work in at the beginning and gather all that information.
Right, because you really are not even reinventing the wheel, you're inventing the wheel because this, and in its time was a brand new area. And to be able to really dive in blind and put the pieces of the puzzle together when it has never been put together before is a huge accomplishment. So congratulations on being able to work that process to be able to get some fantastic results for your clients. And then that knowledge and experience of doing that has given you such a great background in terms of the information that you can use to strategically build these cases, establishing that agency and really understanding how these rideshare companies work beyond the documents and SOPs that they have in place, but by building a real understanding of what is legitimate versus what is kind of gray area versus what's complete bunk and garbage. And what was funny is after I heard your presentation that day, I had to leave a little bit early from Atlas to fly home, go be with the family. And it was a travel nightmare day where I ended up, instead of taking a flight from Charlotte to Raleigh, I had to get into an Uber and drive 2 hours to get to Raleigh because my plane was canceled. But I talked with that Uber driver a little bit about your presentation. I was like, I hear that, some of the practices that are in place are not necessarily what they are purported to be. And he expanded on that and gave me some more inside information just by having these conversations and really getting a real understanding of how does it actually work on the back end. And I would imagine that as an attorney, having those conversations and really kind of peeling back the veil can help you build some fantastic legal strategy to push through those initial insurance offers and get to a settlement amount that's actually going to serve your client well.
Yeah, Lindsay, it's actually funny that you say that. When we first started doing rideshare cases, I constantly took rideshare, constantly, because I would ask the drivers. I would take that as an opportunity to ask them all the questions that I had, right? Because at the beginning, with an emerging field, you don't even know what the documents are called, right? Nobody knows what the rideshare companies are naming their documents. In truck litigation, we knew. There's a lot of federal regulations that tell them what they have to keep, but with rideshare, there really wasn't that. So at the beginning, I was kind of just throwing everything in the kitchen sink at it, right? I don't know what they call it, but I'm going to describe it the best I can. I know they have to have it, right? So I would be making it up and I would be sending request after request after request until I hit the nail on the head and they had to give it to me, right? And some of that knowledge did come from talking to the drivers, because I would be like, hey, just walk me through, like when you turn on the app, what's going on? Like, what do you have to put in? What information is coming to you? I'd be watching their screens, how do you get rides? How do you accept rides? So yeah, you can get a lot of information just talking to the rideshare drivers themselves.
Talking to the rideshare drivers, becoming a rideshare driver, like figuring out that first or second hand account of how does this really work? And you can get some amazing information to build off of from there. Well, thank you so much for coming on, but give us one last tidbit. What can our listeners learn from this type of case that can be applied to other types of legal cases?
Here's what I would say. If you're involved in a rideshare case, if you are an attorney or if you're specifically a victim of a rideshare accident, one thing that you want to make sure that you do is that you have somebody who is going to go the distance with you. These cases can be draining, and they can be very complicated and very time consuming. And you need to make sure that you're working with somebody who has the resources and that fire in their belly to keep going and keep fighting. One thing that we learned in this case is, if you don't have somebody in your corner who's going to be fighting every step of the way, somebody who might tap out once they get to that, say, $1 million offer, you're never going to know the full potential. So you need somebody who's going to fight, because they're definitely going to fight back and they're going to keep punching. And you need to make sure, going into all of your cases, that you maintain that fighting spirit and that you keep pushing forward, because at the end, you can end up with a great result, and really, really change somebody's life for the better, after they've already been through such a horrific ordeal. Sometimes their spirits are down, and they don't know what's going to come next, and they're scared. But just to know that they have somebody fighting in their corner, it can make a big difference. And hopefully at the end, you can get them the resources that they're going to need to make that big difference in their life going forward.
Right. And I mean, attorneys that are listening to this, even if you haven't worked a lot of rideshare cases, there are other people out there who have. The information is available. The strategies have been implemented. So you at least are not in a position where you have to invent the wheel. So lean on your network, lean on people who have done this before. Do your research, get creative, find some way to get inspired, because in a lot of cases, there are ways to push beyond that million. Well,
Absolutely. And I always say a rising tide lifts all boats. So we're never on an island alone. There are people who have paved the way. There are people who can help, and there's resources out there. So you just can't be afraid to ask, and can't be afraid to fight for it. So
that's great advice. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Katie. I've really, really enjoyed having you on.
thank you for having me, Lindsay.